Mercury, Gemini, Apollo. These are all space programs that the United States ran in the 1960s. They were set in motion by President Kennedy setting the goal in 1961 for a manned flight to the moon, landing on the moon by the end of the decade. Now you might be wondering, what does this have to do with my construction company? Well, it's very interesting. The Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs had different aims and goals to them. The Mercury program was all about, can we be in space? The Gemini program was all about, what can we do in space, and can we do the things necessary to get to the moon? And then the Apollo program was getting to the moon. When you're building your business, you need to set out big goals for you to pursue, your Apollo moonshots, so to speak. But as you look at where you are, you may be very much in the Mercury stage, figuring out whether or not you can get to the moon. And as you set that goal, there's the Gemini stage of the business where you have to learn how to do things that you're not very comfortable doing. And that's what this episode of the podcast is all about. Specifically, it's all about how you are using your time, because it is your time that is your most valuable asset. And if you don't know how to use your time effectively, you'll never be able to go from just orbiting the Earth to landing on the moon. My guest today is Doug Howard. He is with Remodelers Advantage. And in this discussion, we have a tremendous amount of time focused on how you can move from working in your business to working on your business. And that may sound like a bit of a cliche, but it really is the truth. If you're going to take your construction company to where it is that you want to go, you have to elevate your game and spend more time planning, developing your people, understanding your financials, and making sure that you are achieving more through others. And that's what this episode is all about. Thank you for listening to Construction Genius. I hope you enjoy my discussion today with Doug. Feel free to give us a rating or a review wherever you get your podcasts, and share this episode with other people. This is Eric Anderton, and you're listening to Construction Genius, a leadership masterclass. Thomas Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. If you're a construction leader, you know all about the perspiration, and this show is all about the 1% inspiration that you can add to your hard work to help you to improve your leadership. Doug, welcome to Construction Genius.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
You know, I know you've been working with businesses, helping them with strategic planning and a variety of other needs for the past 27 years. And in that time, what would you say are the top 1 to 3 issues that a business faces that limits their growth?
Sure. No, it's a great question. When businesses are growing and it gets limited, it's usually one of 3 things. It's financial reasons, it's staffing or staff capability, and it's the owner's time or the leadership team's time, the time that they have to spend working on the business.
Okay, so that's a phrase that many of my listeners will be familiar with, this idea of working on the business as opposed to working in the business, and managing your time in such a way that so you can spend more time working on the business. So I'd like to explore that with you here today. Why do people struggle with this whole concept of working on the business as opposed to in the business and managing their time?
Yeah, I think there's really 2 reasons. One is, I think that for a lot of folks, they've grown up in the business by being the doer. You know, they've started a company or they've been promoted through a company by being the person that could take a project or take a department and really be the person doing the work, doing the planning, doing the execution. And to a great extent, you know, all of a sudden being that person that is stepping back, that's training other people, that gets their success through the performance of others, I think is a huge adjustment. I think it's something that just for a lot of folks doesn't come naturally. It's not where they've had their training. And frankly, they like being in this industry because they like the work. They like being in and around the projects and the people and those kinds of things. I think the other reason it's challenging is because in the normal course of projects and things like that, when issues come up and fires pop up, We get a little bit more maybe into that firefighting mode as opposed to sort of fire prevention mode. And, so a lot of times it's, hey, I have to jump in here. This has to get done. Deadlines are in front of us. And, particularly in times like right now, when there's just a tremendous demand for work and some challenges, it's hard to believe that, you can step back and maybe spend some time being more strategic or maybe time away from the business.
It's interesting because you use that phrase, a couple of different things I noticed that is the firefighting, people get into that role, but then also, and I think this is one of the toughest ones for people, is that they actually like it. That's what they're familiar with. That's what their comfort zone is. And when they get into a higher level role, it's not natural for them to function in that way. And they begin to feel uncomfortable.
Yes. It's funny. A lot of times when I'm on a strategic planning project, someone will start by saying, we love our company. We love what we're doing. We want to grow, but we don't want to become corporate. And they use that word corporate as if it's sort of the epitome of, what not to be that structure, not to be that big company, even in some cases when they've grown to be a fairly substantial size organization.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know many companies that, they're 50, 60, 70, even $100 million, and they're definitely not corporate, but they do suffer from that lack of structure. So what is the impact on a business when people are struggling with their time and they get stuck working in the business as opposed to on the business?
Yeah, well, I think, the biggest thing is really that the other assets of the company, the other resources that are needed for growth, the financial side and the staff development side really need nurturing, and it's hard sometimes for folks to believe how big their company's grown. And sometimes I'll say to them, if you were to leave this job and go apply to be the vice president of whatever at a comparably sized company, what areas would you feel comfortable in? And a lot of times they would say, well, I wouldn't. And yet they're the president of their company, they're at the helm. And so what's interesting is, that how do we develop that middle level of management? How do we groom successors? How do we put processes in place that are repeatable? Are all things that the company really needs, but sometimes doesn't get the appropriate level of attention, partly because what you're saying with comfort zone, some of it is just because of how they allocate the time that they need. And so sometimes that can be really challenging for the team. A lot of times we'll hear, we're disorganized or we need more leadership or those kinds of things. But generally, companies that get to, even several $1 million in revenue need to be managed. And that's a job in and of itself. And I think for most people that I work with, they don't see that as a job. They see it as something that they do around the job that they have. They're still leading the sales effort for the organization or production or whatever it may be. And so, when we look at an org chart and they lay out the departments correctly and their names in 4 or 5 boxes, it's pretty telling that they're still very much immersed in the business.
So that sounds like an interesting exercise for someone to do, is to lay out that org chart. And, in construction, obviously you got to get the work, you got to bid it, you then got to plan it and build it, and then you got to get paid for it. It would be interesting for someone to be able to lay out the org chart with the various functions and see how many boxes they're filling at the moment.
Yes. And one of the things that we do once they do that is we have them take each one of those roles and list them from the one they would first most likely want to give up to the last one they'd want to give up. If they could only have one role left in the organization, what would it be? And that starts a good discussion about how to build the team around them, where they're spending time that maybe they could use their time more effectively. The other thing is looking at all of the responsibilities that they have. And this was something that another remodeling company had just described to me a couple months ago, which I thought was a great exercise. Listing your all your responsibilities, but then putting them in order from the highest value to the lowest value.
Yeah.
This is something I'm doing that's a $15 an hour exercise, as opposed to this is something that's a $50 an hour. And then looking at, where do I draw the line and say, of these things that are below that line, how do I delegate them? How do I train somebody else? Because, for everybody, there's a certain element of things that somebody else could be doing.
That's
where they really start to get leverage on their time, if they go down that path.
Yeah. So there's 2 key points there. Number one, what's the first thing you want to give up, and what's the last thing you want to give up? And then the other point is how valuable is your time? And this is something that I talk to my clients about all the time is your time is probably worth in the range of $200 to $1,000 an hour.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It really is. And if you're not focused on only doing tasks that are worth that amount, then you are wasting a tremendous amount of time and ultimately money. Yep. Now, what's interesting though is it seems like there's two issues in growing a business that need to be addressed. The first one is mindset, and then the second one is education. So let's say I'm a construction person. I started out in the field. I've built a successful business and I know how to make money, but I perhaps don't understand all the financial ins and outs in as much detail as I need to. That seems to me like an education issue. Is that correct?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's, and it doesn't necessarily even need to be really formal education. It's really more of having, the right training and the roadmap. It is very common that someone will say to me, balance sheets or financials or, that's just not my world. I don't get it. And I always tell them, if you can take a blueprint and build a building,
yeah, right.
I absolutely know for certain we can navigate a balance sheet. It's just like you said, it's really more their perspective.
Yeah, that's excellent. Now, but then the other mindset piece that I know a lot of folks struggle with is that they're leading a team, but they're convinced that they either need to control everything or they can do everything better than everybody else. And therefore they micromanage.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you have does that ring true with you?
It does. As a matter of fact, I was just giving a talk about a week ago to a group. And, I said, when you're at the end of a game, right? If you're at the end of a basketball game and the game's on the line, there's a certain number of folks that want the ball. And there are a certain number of folks that don't want to be anywhere near the ball. Right. But if you've built a company, if you've gone out, you've staked your claim, you've grown, you're generally the kind of person that says, hey, if there's 10 seconds left on the clock, I want the ball. Right. But then all of a sudden we start telling them, well, what you really need to do is not only not get the ball, but you have to be on the sidelines developing folks. In fact, it's actually, a foul if you touch the ball. Right. And so what it comes down to is a whole different set of perspectives. And, there's a good reason why in most cases, player coaches don't work out really well. It's hard to truly coach somebody else when you're waiting to see if someone's going to pass you the ball. And so when they get into but that's been their natural inclination for many, many years. There's also this notion that, in the process of developing a company or developing a staff, I've got to insulate my customer. So the safety net oftentimes with managers is just give that back to me. I know how to take care of that. And, I had a really interesting gentleman about 3 or 4 years ago. Very soon when I got into sort of working with the remodeling companies, and he had grown very successfully, had really grown very quickly. And I said, what do you attribute that to? He said, I budget a certain amount of money every year for mistakes. For mistakes. He said, I know when I put somebody in a position of responsibility, they're not going to be able to truly learn the job if I don't let them do it and make some mistakes. Now, he said, we work really, really hard to make sure we catch the mistakes. We insulate the customers from that, those kinds of things. But it's really hard to ask somebody to take on a management responsibility, start making decisions, or take on an area of responsibility within the operation, and then expect that they're going to do everything as well as you do. And so there's that period of time where you have to sort of trust your processes, communicate as well as you can, and develop them. But you have to also be willing to accept there's a learning curve, right? It's going to take some time.
I really like that idea of budget for mistakes. And I know that might sit in a difficult way with many people listening because, hey, I don't want to have to lose money, but there's that insight that if I'm ever going to develop my team, it's going to cost me something upfront in time and money. But that initial investment, if I do it right, will pay off in the long run. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Exactly right. And there's only so much you can learn before you're in a position where you make the decision, you have the ability to impact things positively or negatively. And at some point when you're training that person, there are going to be some costs. There are going to be some hiccups along the way. And, it's interesting in this industry, maybe it's partly because of the size of companies and how they grow. But training is an area where there is just a tremendous need. Management training, leadership training, process training, those kinds of things. And it's hard to really, stop an operation that's, very busy, has a lot going on, and really develop that in their folks. But, companies that really are successful over a long period of time, they've made an investment and they've gotten good at that training process.
Yeah, that's excellent. Now, you use this phrase, insulate my customers. I'd like to explore that a little bit with you, because that's what people do is they control all of these customer relationships, and they become the business, or they are the business. And because of that control, they hinder the growth of the business. So how does someone who is used to insulating the customer move from that mindset to the mindset of allowing my people to interact with the customers and being willing to manage that relationship?
Yeah, it's funny because some folks are really, really good at that, and others really, really struggle with that right up until their last days of business ownership. Even when someone's thinking about transitioning the business, even maybe to a family member or someone that's been on staff for a long period of time, there's still that feeling that, hey, that's my name on the building. The customers are equating with me. Because I always like to point out that there's a lot of companies that we know the name of out there that it's hard to remember that was the name of an individual back at some point in history, right?
Yeah.
H&R Block was a guy.
Yeah, right.
Sears and Roebuck or Hewlett and Packard, those were people, and somehow the company survived long after that person was handling the customer and, being that point of contact. And so a lot of it comes down to how do you help your team build a culture of, the values. And there was a great book called The Founder's Mentality that came out a couple of years ago. And it's, companies that have grown to a certain point and maybe grown beyond the first generation of ownership. There's a certain point, and Apple went through this, other companies have gone through it, where you need to kind of reinvoke the founders' thinking when they actually started the business. What was their passion? Why did they start it? Because the more you can put yourself in that founder's way of thinking, the easier it is, especially if the founder's still there, for them to take, a little bit of a leap of faith in that you're going to continue down that path. So I think that's some of it. I think a lot of it is really, though, understanding that there's a certain point in an organization where it's more about building the team than it is about building, sort of a practice, if you will. Yep. And so I think for folks to understand, it's the success of the team, how you cast that credit. And then, again, building some of those safeguards in-house, so that just because we're on a learning curve, we don't want the customer to experience, disruptions or poor communication or those kinds of things. And that's really where some of the cost comes in that we're talking about too is, you may have to double up on some things to make sure that while we're handing things off, the customer is insulated from that. They're not experiencing the disruption or whatever.
So what would you recommend are some first steps someone can take to become more effective in the way that they manage their time?
Sure. So I think, when we look at a 5-year plan, I always like to say to folks, tell me what the keys to success are. So we'll lay out sort of where we are today, where we want to be 5 years from now, size of the company, what the owner is doing and all that. And that's generally a pretty easy thing for them to wrap their head around. And I don't really care much about what happens in those in-between years in this particular conversation. Just tell me anything that's going to be true 5 years from now that's not true today, right? And then in that, what are the things that are going to happen for that to come to pass, right? And so one of the examples I give is, when we were going through the space program, the moonshot, right? There was the Mercury program that was about getting into space. There was the Apollo program that was putting it all together and going to the moon. A big part of the success, though, was the Gemini program in between, which was based on the idea, these are all the things we're going to have to do to be able to get to the moon that we have no idea how to do today, right? Docking 2 ships together, staying in space with 2 people for 2 weeks, all those things. Every business, when they're transitioning and growing, needs to understand what their Gemini program is. They need to understand what are the things I'm going to have to be good at that's not a problem if we just stay in the orbit that we're in today, or stay at the sales level that we're at today, or if the owner stays, immersed in everything. when we start extracting them out of that and say, okay, not only are we going to talk about that, but we're also going to start taking you out of blocks on the org chart. That list of things that needs to start happening drives the growth of the business. Now, the key to that, though, is taking it from a philosophical exercise to something practical.
Right.
And so what's interesting was when they finish that and they say, okay, I need to be spending 20% of my time focused on planning. I need to be doing more in marketing. I need to do a lot more training. And then I asked them to show me their outlook for the next 90 days. And I'm a big believer in sort of color coding outlook. I like to be able to look at it quickly and say, these are day-to-day responsibilities. This is future looking stuff. This is marketing. And whatever color we designate for future looking things barely exists.
Yep.
Putting out fires is the vast majority of the color that we see.
Yep.
It becomes a real good indication. And then, even just like, well, tell me about last week. Tell me. And so as people are planning, and maybe you can't do it right off the bat, but if you're telling me 25% of your time needs to be developing staff and that kind of thing, and we're at very little right now, what are the steps? What's going to get us there? And that discipline's hard, but it's one of those things that becomes a real limiting factor. The things we know we should do, and of course, it's like every other walk of life, whether it's conditioning or other things. If we just did what we knew we should do, life would be pretty easy. So that's really where we translate. It's like I want to see that schedule and the focus of time and activities coincide with what you're telling me has to be true at some point in the future.
So let me take you back to, I like that analogy there. So you've got the Mercury program.
Yep.
And then you got the Gemini program and the Apollo program. So the Apollo program got us to the moon, but the Gemini program is the one in between, taking us from sort of orbiting around to doing a little bit more. I'd like to take that back and relate it to something that you said earlier about the business owner making a list of the things that they don't want to do. How does that idea of the Gemini program reference relate to this idea of things that the business owner doesn't maybe want to do? Let's say there's things on that Gemini list that need to get done, but he or she is like, I don't want to do that. Someone else needs to do that. How does that dynamic play out?
Sure. No. Well, what it does is it becomes part of the strategy for who we're going to need to add to the team, right? How we're going to develop them, and then outside resources we need to bring into the fold. And so, if we have someone that really just does not like, for instance, the estimating side of things, which is something I hear a lot, then, that capability is not only going to need to exist in the current world, but it may need to be expanded significantly depending on the kinds of projects we're taking on.
Right.
And so we're either identifying someone on staff that has that capability and we need a training and development plan. We need to look outside for that capability. But, and we see a lot of this even with sales. Sometimes someone will say, well, I love sales. I'm going to stick with that to the very end. And then you look at what the revenue projections are and say, can you personally sell that much? Well, no. Well, do we have a sales process? Do you have other people selling? Even just not being the sole person that does it is a challenge for some folks, And so it really comes down to, as we're extracting those folks out of things that they really don't want to be doing long term, it really enhances that Gemini list to say, okay, well, not only do we have to do these things, but we got to figure out where that's going to come from.
So let me ask you this. How much time in your experience should a senior leader be spending working on the business as opposed to in the business?
I mean, I think ultimately when the company gets to a size that can support it, it probably ought to be maybe 50, 60% of their time. I think where I meet most people along the road, it's almost off the radar. And so we're really happy if we can get to 10, 15% of their time and then a steady growth in that way.
Right.
But if someone's spending about a quarter or a third of their time really thinking about things for the future, developing things in the long run, they're on the right track. They're making headway. So
what if I've tried, I know everyone listening to this to one degree or another could say, I can get better at managing my time. And there's probably folks who've done well for like a week or two, or maybe even a month, but then they just get sucked back into that comfort zone or into the firefighting as you described it. What if I've tried and failed? What do I need to do to kind of get a reset and try again, so to speak?
Sure. Yeah, it's funny. A couple of years ago, I wrote a column and cited the date. I forget exactly what the date was, but there's a certain date where almost everybody's New Year's resolutions have gone by the wayside. And it's not that far into the year, right?
Yeah, right.
So to me, it's all about accountability. It's all about, first of all, if I'm going to commit to a goal, we believe very much in very specific, measurable goals, getting them down in print somewhere. And really the key is having an accountability partner. For some people, it's a colleague. For some people, it's a coach. For some people, it's a peer group. But that notion of accountability is really, I think, what brings people back to center. And it's true in all walks of life, but it's definitely true in business ownership. One of the big challenges, I think, for a lot of folks is when they're in business for themselves, a lot of the folks that are around them, they work for them, they go home, maybe they deal with family members, but there's not really somebody, unless it's maybe a 50-50 partnership, where there's a true sense of accountability. At the end of the day, the boss can lay out a 12-step process, but if they want to skip step number 4, in most cases, no one's going to stop them,
right.
Or if they should be spending their time a certain way, someone may nudge them a little bit, someone may raise that issue. But again, it really comes down to that accountability.
Tell me, in your mind, what are give me first your definition of accountability, and then share with me a model that is simple but powerful in terms of people keeping each other accountable.
Sure. So, I think accountability to me is at some interval, whether it's, monthly or quarterly, the most important things, the things that are going to drive the business forward. We have a clear sense of what those things are, who's doing them, who's taking responsibility for them. And there's a measure, there's a clear measure. I always tell people one of the biggest challenges in business right now is a lot of objectives are ambiguous. They're not clear. Someone working in a business doesn't know if they've won or not won. They're waiting for someone else to tell them, right? And so in that sense, we want to make sure that those are clear, specific objectives, things that we're going to do. And then when it comes to accountability, a lot of where I spend my time is coaching, right? I work with about 40, 50 clients at a time. And a lot of what we do is spend time talking about, this is what you told me was important. Where are you in the process? What's the obstacle? One of the things I most like about Remodelers Advantage is that whole company was born on the premise of peer groups, putting groups of business owners together from different geographies so that they felt comfortable sharing financial information and personnel. They weren't stealing from each other, but and the core of the program is they meet twice a year. They make commitments in the spring and the fall, and then they have a monthly phone call with some subset of that group where people are strictly looking at, this is the commitment you made. How far along are you? Because we know the steady cadence of making those commitments over a period of time, 3, 4, 5 years, can change the whole scope of the organization. But it really needs to be that outside force, I think, that really can, and it doesn't even need to be somebody necessarily in the same industry, but It needs to be someone that knows you well enough that you're telling the real story.
Yeah, right. Yep. Why do you think people struggle with accountability?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. I think, first of all, sometimes people just don't want to do the very difficult things that it takes. The reason those things are on a list and have to be thought through, it's because the things that are not coming naturally. I was reading a book the other day, and there was a quote from Jerry Rice that said something to the effect that I'm going to do things that no one else wants to do today so that I can do things that no one else will be able to tomorrow.
Yeah, right.
And so I think that essence of, they're difficult things. It's hard to put that effort in. But I think a lot of it is also that, the idea of putting out fires, it's not something just in the mind of the owner. Those problems really exist. And I think understanding that for every problem that exists, we need to be going back to the system, process, not just to solve the problem, but to prevent it from happening again in the future. A lot of times we spend time solving the same problems over and over and over, and people are exhausted, as opposed to saying, we've got to structurally fix that so we don't keep doing the same thing.
Yeah.
But for a lot of folks, it almost seems like there's just too much work at hand to even have time to stop and really fix some of those things, So we'll spend 4 hours fixing a problem that would have taken an hour to prevent.
Yeah, interesting. So let's say I buy your logic that I need to get out of the weeds, so to speak. I need to work more on my business. What are 3 or 4 action items I should take right away to begin to make that incremental progress?
Sure. Well, like I said, the first going back to what we just said is I'd find an accountability partner for whatever you do.
Right.
Identify that person, make sure they know that that's the role you're asking them to play, open up communications, that kind of thing. The second is, whether it's a formal plan or, goals, you got to look to the future and say, okay, whatever that next iteration of where we're headed is, how clearly can I define it? How clearly can I get down in my mind what the role is going to be, what I want my role to be, what the structure is going to be. And then those keys to success, the things that have to happen in between that Gemini notion, I think is so critical for every business owner. It's because they really need to know, if I do free up an hour of my time, what am I going to apply it to? What am I going to put my effort into? And it's usually not just doing more of the same thing. It's usually doing something different, and then I think, really the last piece is making sure that the real investment of time is being made. Find some way to really look at, what percentage of my time am I spending doing what? And, it's interesting because for most folks, once they get into this mode, they actually find, not surprisingly, they can accomplish more by working less,
Yep.
And so, matter of fact, our company's tagline is earn more, work less, period, because we don't see a correlation between the people not taking vacation and the people, making extraordinary amounts of money. The people that are actually taking 8 weeks of vacation that have good systems and well-developed teams, they're the ones taking the most amount of it.
Yep.
Sometimes we feel like we're just going to work our way out of whatever's in front of us, as opposed to realizing it's the system that's going to get us there. It's the team that's going to get us there.
Excellent. So just to summarize and identify that accountability partner, whatever entity that is, define where you want to go, figure out that Gemini piece of, the in-between piece that perhaps you're going to have to learn to do something that you haven't done yet. And then really set aside that time and be honest with yourself on how you're allocating your time and focus in on doing whatever you can to increase the amount of time you're spending working on the business.
Yeah.
Excellent.
That's great. Great place to start.
Doug, so give us a little bit more about what you do and who you are and where we can get in touch with you.
Sure. So I'm Director of Consulting for Remodelers Advantage. So Remodelers Advantage still has a very successful peer group program. So I get to facilitate some of those peer groups. But then we also developed a consulting capability to do on-site strategic planning with companies, which is either based around building that 5-year model with the team or process improvement. And then I do a lot of one-on-one coaching. One of the nice byproducts of the last year and a half is people have gotten much more able and comfortable with Zoom. So it makes remote work a little bit easier in that regard. And it's usually a cadence of an hour-long call every other week because there's a certain amount of time people need to do things in between.
Yeah.
But it's really all designed around that Gemini model. We have an idea of where they want to go. We watch the numbers very closely. We watch the key indicators. And then everything is about what are we doing today to kind of make that picture come to reality.
That's terrific. And where can people get in touch with you?
So my email is doug@remodelersadvantage.com. If someone wants to talk to me, they can actually go right to www.15minuteswithdoug.com, and that'll take them to my calendar. And they can actually pick up 15 minutes there, or they can just go to the remodelersadvantage.com website.
Excellent. And we'll put links in the show notes to all of those links so that people can get in touch with you. Doug, I really appreciate your time. Great insights into how we can use our time more effectively. And I can assure you that you're right on the mark in terms of the need for people to be able to do that. So I appreciate you joining me here today.
My pleasure. It was great.
Awesome. Today's episode was brought to you by the Construction Conclave. If you as a construction leader would like to develop your skills and get involved in a community of like-minded construction professionals who are focused on building healthy teams, profitable projects, and long-term successful businesses, then the Construction Conclave is for you. It's a private invitation-only group of construction leaders that are focused on developing their leadership skills. We do training every single month online that looks at how to become a better leader in a very practical, straightforward way. We also have other events that build community and camaraderie so that you can associate with others who are interested in developing their skills as leaders. If you'd like more information and to see if you qualify for participating in the conclave, feel free to reach out to me, Eric@ericanderic.com. anderton.com. Thank you for listening to this episode of Construction Genius. Hope you found that 1% of inspiration to help you in the next few days. If you like the show, please give us a 5-star review on iTunes, share it with other construction leaders who you think would benefit, and thanks again for listening.